Hi everyone, this is Yana Smakula and thanks for joining me today. In this video, I'll show you several different ways to use a folk dance stencil from Simon Says Stamp. This is a new product from Simon, a part of their Simon Says Love release. I personally got very excited about this stencil as, to me, it felt different from the other stencils that Simon had released previously. And what I mean by this is that this particular stencil is very solid and it has a little open space to it. So it's almost like a negative kind of stencil. I'm not sure if you know what I mean, but hopefully you'll understand what I have in mind as you watch this video. Now, I love working with stencils as there's just a ton of things that they can be used for. One of the ways to use any kind of stencil, the most common way, is obviously to apply ink through the stencil to create a beautiful background. Here I have a piece of white cardstock. This is Nina Solar White. I taped it onto my stencil from the back so that it stays put and it's not going to move. And I'm using my Simon Says Stamp Deep Sea ink. This is a nice deep blue to blend blue color through the stencil onto my paper. This particular design looked very Scandinavian to me, and I associate blue with this style. So I knew I wanted to use a lot of blue, well, mainly blue color for all of my cards today. I blended this ink rather heavily onto the paper, and I just went with one solid color. If you have smaller ink blending tools like little ink daubers, I was so sure that I had some, but I just couldn't find them, so I couldn't do another kind of blending. But anyhow, if you do have the tiny daubers, you can do selective ink blending and blend the flowers in red and yellow and keep the leaves blue. Or of course, you can use other colors, but I just wanted to try that. I couldn't find my daubers. I don't know where they are. Maybe I never even brought them with me from Ukraine when I moved. Honestly, I could not remember, but had I had them, I would have definitely tried that. I tried blending with a Q-tip and with my finger, and that just didn't work. So tiny daubers are a must for a stencil like this if you want to try to do different color blending. Or you can do masking too, and you can just mask parts of the background, and I will share that in a slightly different context. But for multicolor ink blending, I think that the little daubers are a must. Now, you can also dry emboss with stencils. It's like an embossing folder. It can emboss your paper, but the impression is not going to be as deep as with the embossing folder. Here I've set up my platinum decking and embossing machine from Spellbinders. You can see the rest of my messy desk because I zoomed out a little bit. I tried to tidy up my desk so I don't have anything weird in my video frame, but it is a true mess, a mess of a true card maker. So I'm going to also dry emboss this ink blended background with a stencil. Now, it won't show up much in the photos, but in real life, you'll be able to tell that the ink design is embossed, so raised a little bit, especially if you touch the paper with your fingers, you'll be able to tell that there is embossing to it. The cool thing about the platinum machines from Spellbinders, there's a Platinum 6 and there's this Platinum, which is the larger one, is that they come with all the plates and mats that you need to cut and emboss. And the platform, the base platform, actually has a cheat sheet. There are instructions printed right there on the platform, so you don't have to try and remember how to build the sandwich for cutting and embossing. Now, I do this every day for my work. I die cut and emboss all day long, so I remember what mats and plates I need to use. But if you don't emboss often with your machine, it's helpful to check this platform to see the embossing guide. So here I have my platform, my 10 embossing mat, my paper, and the stencil, and I'm covering that with a blue embossing plate. And here we have this fun embossed design on the paper. Like I mentioned, it's hard to see on the inked side, but it actually shows really well on the opposite side. And I have shared many videos in the past using a stencil to do dry embossing, and I will try to link to some of those here. Okay, another thing I wanted to try with my stencil that didn't really work out, but it was a cool idea, was inking it up with white pigment ink, embossing with the inked stencil on blue cardstock, and finally heat embossing the original inked background with white embossing powder. I know it all sounds complicated. It was a little bit too complicated for me, but I still wanted to share this idea with you because I also like to share not just the successful things that I've tried, but also things that have failed for me. I think I ended up adding a little bit too much ink onto some of the areas as I wasn't blending the ink with my ink blending tool. I was just tapping with my ink blending tool onto the stencil. So I was building up a good amount of ink there. And when I went to my die cutting machine to emboss, the pressure from the machine was just so strong that I had too much ink there, that the ink ended up seeping through the stencil and it messed up my design. It's like when you use a stencil and paint, on furniture, for example. When you add too much paint, it can seep under the stencil and mess up the design. Practice makes perfect with these kind of things. This is not something that I do all the time, so it didn't work perfectly for me, but I learned my mistakes, and if I were to do this again, I now know that I need to add less ink to the paper. The negative blue piece did look cool, and I think I saved it for later. I was hoping I could use it for another card. Maybe I will try this technique again with another color of ink. We'll just have to see. The other blue cardstock piece, I wanted to heat emboss it in white embossing powder, and I did add the powder. I tried heat setting it, but I felt in the end that it was just a little bit too messy for me, and I ended up not using this background. Okay, moving on. Another thing I like to use my stencils for or with is with texture paste. Here I have this little jar of texture paste from Ranger. This one is almost dry. Now, I have to say that I live in Arizona and it is very dry here. And I have noticed that liquids tend to evaporate faster and products do dry out faster. So this is just one of those products that I was saving and now it's almost dry. I have had it for more than a year now. It comes much, much creamier when you buy it. So it doesn't come like this. I just wanted to make that clear. So I was kind of having trouble getting this product out of the jar, and you saw that my plastic palette knife didn't even get anything out. So I switched to the metal palette knife from Tonic Studios, and I was determined to get all of that paste out of the jar and onto my paper. Now, this is Simon Says Stamp Soft Navy cardstock, and again, this is that blue Scandinavian inspiration that I mentioned earlier. So I applied a very, very heavy coat of this texture paste onto my paper, and I love the result. I got the dimension, I got the texture. I basically got everything that I wanted from this background and this paste. I tossed the jar after I was done. I'll need to order this again so I can use it more often for my projects, as I just love using this texture paste and any other kind of texture paste with stencils. So I just set it aside to dry and I put it on a background, or I used it as a background for a card in about an hour or two when the paste have had the time to harden. One last thing I wanted to share in this video is using just parts of this background. So I'm going to mask some areas of this design so that I can change up the look of the stencil. The stencil has a pattern to it, there are repeating elements on it, and I want to break it up apart without actually physically breaking up the stencil. And I want to use these elements separately on their own to create a different arrangement on my background. So I'm still using the same elements. I'm even going to use the same colors. I'm just changing up how they are arranged on my background. And to mask the areas that I don't need, I'm using little bits of washi tape. Now, this is somewhat a tedious process because you do need to use those little pieces of tape, but it's just another way to stretch your stencil, and you can use this technique or this trick with other stencils too. Just mask the portion that you need and stencil away. So once I had masked or outlined the areas that I needed, I blended the same blue ink through the stencil and I created a floral frame, so to speak. So I made sure to leave the central section of my background, and this is again Nina Solar White cardstock. I left it white and just blended the design from the stencil coming in from the outside. I think I had the most fun creating this particular background as it gave me a completely different look to my card. I also ended up using Nuvo drops from Tonic Studios in gray, yellow, and red, and I embellished parts of the background using those colors. Now, I used gray for the filler dots, so any blue dot that wasn't a flower center, I coated a lot of those blue dots in gray. And then I used yellow for the flower centers for the large flowers and red for the small flowers. And I'll list the specific colors of the Nuvo drops that I used in my supply list. And I love how I was able to easily add color to this background. Now, this also helped me to cover up some of the little imperfections, the little imperfect blending spots that I had on my card. The sentiments for all 4 of my projects came from an older stamp set from Simon Says Stamp, and I just heat embossed them in white embossing powder onto the navy blue cardstock. And I'll link that specific stamp set that I used in my supplies below. So this finishes this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments section below. If you're new to my channel, be sure to subscribe. If you are a subscriber but are not receiving new video notifications, be sure to check the bell icon on the homepage of my channel to get notified about every new video that I post. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time. Bye!